So, do you like cheese?
More than almost any other animal byproduct.
Oh, then you've come to the right place. For today, we're taking on Icewind Dale, turn-based edition with extra cheese, also known as Solasta Crown of the Magister. Welcome to Ye Olde Entertainment. My name is Alex, and as you know, it is my duty, my mission, my purpose in life to help you decide whether that game that you have been thumping for so long is indeed the right game for you or not. And today, we're going to take on one of the big three D&D/Pathfinder games that were meant to come out in the year 2021. And yes, we all know how that's coming out in the Baldur's Gate 3 side of things.
Coming. He said he's coming now.
But out of these three games, Solasta seemed to be the one that always got the ugly little brother treatment.
He's the little boy that Santa Claus forgot.
But why?
Is it bad?
Not great, not terrible.
Is it really? Well, let's find out. This time I'm going to cut to the chase and ask the most important question first. Is Anna from That Star Wars Girl still single? Who is this game for? I'd say it's, first, for people who like Icewind Dale and turn-based combat. Second, for people who like Icewind Dale. Third, for people who like turn-based combat in their medieval fantasy games.
What about me?
I hear you say. What if I don't like, don't care, or don't even know about Icewind Dale? Well, if RPGs are your jam, I think there's still a lot to like about Solasta Crown of the Magister, and if you like when developers push the envelope with new, fresh, and exciting ideas, then this might just be the one for you. Let's find out why. As you know, I rate games according to a system of categories that feel relevant to the genre of the game at hand, and this time we got a D&D classic RPG, which in spite of having turn-based combat, and despite the fact that it uses the 5th edition D&D ruleset, can very much be compared to the original Icewind Dale games from the 2000s. And when it comes to those, character creation and character progression are especially important. So let's start there. Character creation was one of the best things in Icewind Dale and Icewind Dale 2. You could create your entire party of adventurers from the get-go, or choose from a selection of pre-made characters in Icewind Dale, or a pre-made band of adventurers with their own name and background story in Icewind Dale 2. In Solasta Crown of the Magister, you can also create your party from scratch, or you can choose the pre-made adventurers that are available. There are a couple of things that you should know if you're an Icewind Dale seasoned veteran. First, you'll be running around with a party of 4 adventurers, not 6, and that means that combat might come off as a little bit less tactical than in those other games. Some combat situations in Icewind Dale 2, for example, required you to cover your rear guard with your off-tank character. Some fights required you to have a little bit of extra healing for your tank, and some others required you to apply various means of crowd control. It was deliciously beefy, and it was so in part because all your characters were needed at all times. Solasta's combat is not at all boring, and we'll get into that a little later, but because you command 4 adventurers instead of 6, it might not feel as deep as it did in Icewind Dale and Icewind Dale 2. Second, the creators of Solasta didn't have the full D&D license as I understand it. That means that you don't have all those races, classes, and subclasses you've grown accustomed to in D&D games. There's dwarves, humans, elves, half-elves, and halflings in Solasta. And since I don't really mind the races of those who tag along my strong, resourceful, and handsome dwarf leader, I'm okay with this limitation. But if you're the kind of guy or gal who must absolutely play an orc, or a tiefling, or an Aasimar, or God knows what else, well then you're a nerd. Then you may find the races available in Solasta to be insufficient. Dwarves, elves, and halflings each have a couple of lineages that you can choose from. And as you might imagine, these lineages offer different advantages. Marsh halflings, for example, have extra constitution, while island halflings have extra dexterity. And while I don't mind that there's only 5 races in Solasta, I do mind that there's only 6 classes available. There's fighters, paladins, clerics, wizards, rogues, and rangers. And in other D&D games in which you command a party of 6, I always liked having a druid and a sorcerer, so I missed not having those in Solasta. Every class has archetypes that you can choose to further hone each character to the role you want him or her to play in the party. Wizards, for example, have arcane traditions, and these can be Shock Arcanist, Lore Master, or Green Mage. If you're missing the druid class, you can always go for the Green Mage arcane tradition, I guess. These archetypes will add further benefits once you hit the levels specified in their description. In addition to their archetypes, fighters also have fighting styles, and these allow you to turn them into tanks or DPS specialists, for example. In Solasta, you can determine your character's ability scores in many different ways. You can roll the dice and just go along with whatever the Goddess of Luck has in store for you, or re-roll until you're happy with the scores, like I know you did in Baldur's Gate, Icewind Dale, and Temple of Elemental Evil.
You dirty fecker.
If you choose this system, you'll have to drag and drop each die to the attribute of your preference. And just in case you don't know what the best options are for the class you're rolling, Solasta's got you covered, pointing out the most important attributes for each class. But if you're too lazy to even do that, you can click on Optimize and let the game assign the dice accordingly. You can also choose the point buy system. With the point buy system, you have a pool of 27 points to spend on all your abilities, or you can cheat yourself like a little bitch. Check the free edit box and get infinite points to assign to all your character's skills. Word of advice though, don't do that to yourself. The game's not all that difficult to begin with, and you'd be cheating yourself out of all the fun. You can also choose skills, and depending on the class, some initial spells. You can also choose your initial equipment, which I think is a cool feature. And later on when you level, you'll also be able to choose some feats. So, standard D&D stuff. This means that as you progress through the game, you'll be leveling. And it also means that leveling is not standardized. For those who are not familiar with D&D, this means that you don't get a fixed number of points to spend on attributes or skills every time you level, as you do in some other non-D&D games. In Solasta, the first time you level, for example, there's nothing for you to choose, but some other times you'll get to choose whether to acquire another feat or get a couple of points to add to your attributes. And if you're a wizard or a cleric, you'll get to learn spells from time to time. This is the D&D way of things, and I am not personally a fan of this. I prefer systems in which you get a set number of points to spend on attributes and a set number of points to spend on skills. In any case, I prefer when leveling up is a standard thing in which you always fiddle around with the same things every time you ding. But whether you agree with this preference or not, the character creation and leveling system in Solasta still serves its primary purpose. And within the game's limitations, I did feel like I had built my little team my way. Or almost my way. And every time I leveled, I felt like I was further strengthening every character to make it better at what I wanted him or her to do in my party. Combat is the main focus in Solasta, just as it is in Icewind Dale. There is, however, one thing that's unique to Solasta, and it's this unique thing where the game truly shines. In addition to everything we've mentioned already, creating your character in Solasta requires you to choose its background and some personality flags. This of course is not exclusive to Solasta Crown of the Magister, but in this game your character's background and its personality flags are used in a way that I thought was
amazing.
For the first time in, well, ever, your characters have personalities, like actual personalities. They can be greedy, cynical, naive, arrogant, patient, cowardly, elitist. There's a slew of potentially delightful blends of personalities to be achieved by means of this little interface here. And there's plenty of situations for your character's personalities to shine. They talk to NPCs and to each other. They come up with suggestions on how to deal with things. They mock each other. They engage in hilarious and sometimes useful party banter while you're exploring. It's beautiful.
That was unexpected. This place is topsy-turvy.
Remind me not to take a dump in that hole.
Do you really have to make jokes?
Yeah, it's in my contract. Did Karen not tell you?
So, are we going?
Why don't you go first? If it's somewhere nice, you can come back and tell us.
Yes, I understand.
Who are you talking to? Wait, what are you doing?
Are you crazy? Why did you put it on?
We have no idea what it does, whether it's evil or anything.
What? I just kind of had to.
We're supposed to share the loot, by the way.
Coward characters, for example, will always suggest to avoid the fight and sneak around. Cynical characters will make smart-ass remarks about how fucked up the party's current situation is. Aristocrat elitists will always complain about how mundane everything and everyone is.
The outside graves were likely for servants and guards. The mausoleum holds a few burials, but its main purpose is to hide this secret entrance. The most important graves are in the catacombs down below.
And by important, you mean rich.
I, for example, had a cleric that was both greedy and cowardly, and it was hilarious to see how conflicted he always was about getting the loot and risking his neck to get it.
Dropping in unannounced on a paranoid recluse with untold magical powers. What could possibly go wrong?
On top of that, you've got dialogue choices that are consistent with each character's personality. So if you think the violent, determined response is the one that best suits the situation at hand, you can let your aggressive character sort things out. Or you can have your persuasive, charismatic, cynic character try to sweet-talk his or her way to the back of the kitchen if you think that's the best approach. It's heartwarming and endearing. It's not without its copious amounts of cheese, but in my book, it's fun, refreshing, and just plain lovable. Solasta is a game that follows the tradition of Icewind Dale though, so make no mistake about it, your adventure and its outcome are going to be linear as fuck. Don't expect your dialogue choices to have an impact on how the story goes. But while your characters' personalities and all the party banter are mostly there just to add adventure flavor to the whole deal, there are a few things that play out depending on what your party decides to do, and it was those tiny details that made a world of difference in my experience. You can also choose languages for your characters to be fluent in, and that will also come into play in the story.
Let me take a look. It looks like ancient Timarian. If you find it, send for... Oh, this appears to be a name.
Who else? Even without Airdroth, Bloodspear never follow Nyarks.
Nyarks. Huh, that's us, just so you know. Probably means piece of...
It means non-orcs, that's all.
You speak Orcish?
Enough to know non-orc from piece of...
Really? Oh, please, what's the word? I must know.
Stop it.
Solasta's character creation and leveling system allows you to implement your own tactical plan while also providing you with the means to create a band of adventurers that'll feel like an actual group of people. Sometimes your party members may come off as dumb or immature, sometimes their conversations are completely inconsequential, and sometimes they are super duper mega cheesy. But they'll always make you feel like you command a group of people who are out there adventuring, rather than an arsenal of tactical assets. Character creation and character progression in Solasta is not without its flaws and limitations, and while it may not be as robust as the character creation and leveling system in the Icewind Dale series, the new things it brings to the table make it worthy enough in my book of getting a great score. Gameplay. So, 5th edition Icewind Dale with turn-based combat. That would be the short version. Now for the longer version. You start your adventure at the local tavern, where you meet Lord Karen, which we are going to call MacGuffinus from now on, because all he ever does is send you to fetch those precious MacGuffins. And after an early stroll around Caer Kiflin, which is where this whole business takes place, and which somewhat resembles your early moments in East Haven, MacGuffinus comes up with a suitable medieval fantasy excuse for you to go to a remote place where there's combat and exploration to be done. So you go to the place, you kill everything there is to kill, you loot the place clean, and you return to MacGuffinus to tell him you're done. Rinse and repeat throughout the entire freaking game. And that is as far as questing is going to go in Solasta. So you get some delightful party banter and make some choices while talking to NPCs, but none of that amounts to much when it comes to getting things done in Solasta. There are no branching paths that come out of your decisions, nor any significantly different approaches to the game situations. Sometimes these dialogue choices allow you to circumvent combat situations. Sometimes there's different ways in which a location may be explored, sometimes different people will tag along, but that's as far as it goes. Quests in Solasta are 85% about going somewhere, killing someone, and or retrieving an item, and or talking to someone. However, this formula is not without some flavor and spice. You meet quite a few characters in your adventures. Some of these characters tag along for a while because they need to explore the same areas you're meant to journey to and search for their own answers. Some other characters are the last remaining members of a company of soldiers who need to be rescued. Some are orcish tribe leaders who need your help against an evil rival tribe. Sometimes unexpected events take place, and sometimes you meet fascinating NPCs that have something important to tell you about your main quest. There's this part, for example, in which your adventures take you to a remote fortress known as the Dark Fortress, that's located in the middle of a marsh. If you take the time to explore the marsh, you might come by this weird hermit hunter, and if one of your characters has the appropriate skill, you may convince or coerce him into giving you information about the fortress and the people who live in it. The good news is that there's also more than one way to get into the fortress, and more than one way to explore it once you're inside. And that adds an interesting bit of replay value to the deal in an otherwise very linear game. Questing in Solasta is but one big succession of excuses that add context to the one big succession of dungeon crawls that constitutes the rest of the gameplay. But as cheap as these excuses are, they do add a fair bit of immersion and purpose. even if they are grated with generous amounts of cheese. But more on that later. There is one thing that I absolutely loved in Solasta. Those companions you created at the beginning of the game have companion quests.
Someone came to see you.
Me? Who?
That's something that you don't ever get in a game in which you create your entire party of adventurers. Or at least, it is something that I had never seen but had always wanted to see in an RPG. These quests depend on your companion's classes. Your wizard, for example, will be asked to help her former master find some ancient tomes that'll help him secure a position at the Wizard Guild or something like that. The location in which this takes place is awesome, and the combat and exploration to be had here are crazy fun. Then there's a quest for your rogue that involves a stolen sword and some typical roguish intrigue and betrayal. I like that in each of these quests, it's not only the character who's doing the quest that does the talking.
I've been looking for you.
I'm waiting for someone, and you're not him. Get lost.
Don't come the hard case with me. You won't win.
Your other companions have opinions and even suggestions to offer, and this input even depends on the personalities you've given them. These quests are all very campy, but loads of fun. But Alex, isn't this game supposed to be all about the combat? Yeah, I'm getting there. Combat in Solasta is turn-based, and while it may seem a little bit difficult at first, once you figure out the ins and outs of combat that are specific to Solasta, it will become significantly easier, maybe even a little bit too easy. And that's why I recommend that you play it on Scavenger or even Cataclysm if you're a seasoned D&D veteran. That's where the fun's to be had in my experience. There's one thing you should know about Solasta though. While Icewind Dale offers a quick and often relentless succession of combat situations, and it occasionally throws in a puzzle, a quest, or an area for you to explore, in Solasta Crown of the Magister, there are plenty of cutscenes, dialogue moments, and fairly large chunks of the game that go by without there being any combat. And I am absolutely fine with this, but those who loved the quick-paced combat action in Icewind Dale may not be crazy about this. For me, Solasta is a top-tier turn-based combat game amongst those that take place in medieval fantasy settings. XCOM 2, Phoenix Point, go check this one out by the way if you're an XCOM fan, belong in a league of their own if you ask me. Solasta has everything a turn-based combat system worth its salt needs to be considered great in my estimation. There's great enemy variety, there's a cover system, there's actions that can trigger in the enemy's turn a la Overwatch, attacks of opportunity, circumstantial allies in some of the missions, you name it. But it's the level design that steals the show here. Combat situations always take place in locations filled with threats and opportunities. There are plenty of things that you can use to your advantage if you take the time to look around the place, like chandeliers that you can shoot down, stairs that you can climb to position yourself and vantage points, lots of opportunities to lure your enemies into choking points, and so on and so forth. I like that every combat scenario is completely different from the one before, and some of those locations are fascinating. And what is combat without a good set of swords, shields, and wands? Do we have any of those in Solasta? Yes. Nothing to write home about, but yes. There are some interesting items to be found while exploring the locations and defeating enemies. There seems to be a combination of fixed and random loot, and I am a big fan of the latter. Make no mistake about it though, there is a lot of garbage, and there are not too many game-changing items to be found in the world of Solasta. But there are some primal items to be found throughout your adventures that can be used to craft some pretty awesome gear if you have the character with the appropriate skill. Some rare and magical items must be attuned before your character can use them. This does not happen immediately, and it can only be done while you are resting. I was not a fan of this. Itemization in Solasta won't win any awards, especially if compared to Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous, but I would say it's serviceable. And while not everything in Solasta is super intuitive, combat definitely is. There's almost no learning curve for those who've played turn-based combat games before. And interface-wise, everything is exactly where you expect to find it, and it's used exactly the way you expect. I wish I had more control over key bindings, but that's a bit of a nitpick. There is unfortunately one thing that tones down the fun factor in Solasta more than a peg or two, and it's this part of the game, especially the combat that takes place in it. As it happens in Baldur's Gate, there's a chance you'll be waylaid by enemies and must defend yourself. I don't necessarily have a problem with being waylaid by enemies and having to defend myself, but there seems to be very little variety of locations and enemies in these random combat situations. These random attacks happen way too frequently in the game, but there are only like 4 or 5 different combos of enemies and locations, so it becomes repetitive and boring really fast. These combat situations and enemies seem to depend on the area of the map you're traversing, so every time you're journeying through a new area, you'll get a new type of waylaid situation. But all of them outstay their welcome very soon, and by the end of the game you're going to be hating these ambushes. There is also exploration in Solasta, and it takes the form of non-mandatory areas within mission-critical locations. For example, in the first location you're asked to go to, there's this path to the right that you may choose to ignore. There are no quest-related characters or places down that path, but if you choose to go that way and crawl under this rock, there's a big area filled with goblins and loot. Then there's the marsh, where the dark fortress is located. You can Rambo your way through the main gates if you wish, and if you can, but if you take the time to look around, you'll find NPCs, loot, and an alternative way to get into the castle. Every location has its own little area or room to discover by means of exploration. In Divinity Original Sin 2, there are huge areas filled with secret locations, places that you can access if you use some combat abilities, and hidden loot everywhere. Pathfinder, Kingmaker, and Wrath of the Righteous have areas filled with loot, combat encounters, and even NPCs locked behind areas that you can only access if you pass a skill check. Exploration is a big part in these games, and that's not the case with Solasta. Locations are more geared towards combat encounters, but every location has its little something in terms of exploration that adds to the fun factor of the experience. There is this location, in which the final boss may be reached in 2 different ways. I think this was an excellent use of exploration in Solasta, and I wish there had been more situations like this. And last but not least, there's puzzle solving. Some puzzles are laughably easy in Solasta, and I'm okay with that, but some others will keep you entertained for a few minutes. I thought some of them were fun and well designed, but the best part about them is that you don't come by any puzzles at times in which you're running for your life or rushing to that climactic plot point. So, it looks like gameplay in Solasta is a 10 out of 10 then. And it would have been if it had not been for this part of the game you're looking at right now. Unfortunately, Solasta's fun factor takes a deep dive when it's time to travel between locations. Traveling between locations in games like this is meant to be all about the immersion and the feeling of adventure. In Solasta, it's a repetitive chore that adds nothing to the experience. And in Cased, for example, you click on a location, and as you travel to said location, your party gets progressively tired, hungry, and fatigued. So you'll eventually have to stop to take a break, cook some meals, and get some shut-eye. In Expeditions Viking, you can choose where to camp. You can have companions with healing talents tend to the wounded. You can have those companions who are good with a bow go out and hunt for some food. You can read some books and learn some talents. And that's how it's done in my estimation. In Solasta, you don't have any real control over camping functions. The only thing you should pay attention to is your reserve of camping supplies. And even that goes out the window when your cleric learns how to conjure food. Now, as your party travels from place to place, you'll see some randomly generated messages like this party member started a heated political discussion, or this party member told old war stories. And I think there was great potential in this, but as it is, it's just random filler. In addition to being pointless and boring, all this traveling seems to take forever, and it's filled with repetitive random ambushes, 60% of which we could have done without. There's also bounty quests in Solasta, and these require you to revisit locations. And I am not at all a fan of revisiting locations because a game says so. Most of the time I had a blast with the gameplay in Solasta. A high quality blast actually, I should say. But it's not perfect, and it does take a serious dive from time to time, especially when you have to journey between locations. Still, this is some of the best medieval fantasy fun I've had in quite a while. Story and lore.
Do you like cheese?
Why, yes, I do.
Oh, then you're going to feel right at home here. Solasta Crown of the Magisters is like the cheese table at a wedding. There's all types and brands available, and at least one of them has to be to your liking.
My favorite's Gouda.
Well, my favorite's this one.
It's similar to some magical wards I've seen, but...
It doesn't work. Perhaps he made a spelling mistake.
I hate you.
There's the off-genre, funny, naive party banter. the chain of plot-convenient lucky events that keeps the story going, the extraordinarily tropey characters and situations, the forced conflict between companions because one of them is lawful and the other one is chaotic, etc. The story in Solasta is hilariously generic, and every character in it seems to be chiseled according to what the plot needs from it, and that's just an atrocious approach to a story and its characters. The lore in this game is laughably shallow, and that is a crime considering the many races, conflicts, and places you can choose from in D&D lore. And even if Tactical Adventures license didn't cover any of it, there's no excuse for this degree of genericness. Let's talk about the story for a moment. So, generic monsters from another world or dimension or whatever are threatening to break into this world and end it all. Some of them have already broken through, and that's how we know they are coming in force. These monsters are known as Sorax. There's a seal in a remote place that needs to be restored so that the Sorax don't come through, and a bunch of information you need to collect before you know how to restore the seal. And between the city of Caer Kiflin and the remote seal holding back the monsters, there's miles of savage country filled with abandoned temples and fortresses that have been claimed by these monsters, or agents of these monsters, or by people who happen to be in possession of some MacGuffin or knowledge you need in order to restore the seal. And I apologize if this isn't quite like things are, but this game gave me attention deficit, and I fear it might even be permanent. So there's a council of people at Caer Kiflin who don't want the Sorax to pour into their lands and destroy everything. This council is comprised of representatives from every major player in the Principality of Masgarth. Aside from the fact that some of them look like generic peasants who are planning a protest at an indoors amphitheater that looks like a council hall, as much as my local short-stay joint looks like the Sheraton, they are astonishingly childish and incompetent. Some of the illustrious council members include this guy, who is blatantly confrontational in a way that only a spoiled 12-year-old would.
How very convenient. So you can offer us no proof of this adventurer's fable.
The princess, and yes, this is the princess, who is always lost in thought and you can never quite tell why.
Your Royal Highness?
Oh, pardon me. Yes, I concur.
And then there's these two guys who never say anything relevant or useful. All these people are hilariously clueless about what they should do about anything, and their plans would leave a 12-year-old scratching his head and wondering what the fuck he just heard. At the beginning of the game, they even doubt the existence of the Sorax. They are a thing of legend, they say. Just a rumor. Where have I heard this before?
Ah yes, Reapers. The immortal race of sentient starships allegedly waiting in dark space. We have dismissed that claim.
But the Sorax are cunning, you see. Every time the Sorax invade a human outpost, after the battle is done, they take their victims' corpses as well as their own with them, and that's why there is no evidence of their existence. So you have to bring the head of a Sorax to the council to prove that these monsters do indeed exist, even if there are 3 different groups of soldiers and deputies who claim to have fought them. And by the way, this is what the head of the Sorax looks like. The game also kinda tries to sell you some subplot about your party becoming entangled in the political machinations of these factions, but they do so with the subtlety of a hydraulic hammer pounding at a glass floor near the local pet refuge. To say that the animosity between these factions comes off as forced and artificial would be a gross understatement.
Mind spoilers coming your way.
If you even care about the story in Solasta, but I really don't think the story is what you pay the price of the admission for in this game. Anyways, at some point near the end of the game, you return to Caer Kiflin, only to find there's a war going on. I couldn't help but laugh at this point. At no point in the story do you get the feeling that there's a war brewing. There are no rising tensions between the factions, no veiled or blatant threats being thrown around at the peasant assembly, and well, there's basically no reason for it. It's like the plot needed to raise the stakes, so they just threw a war at you. And then they justified it with one of the most clumsily concocted information dumps I've ever seen in a game. And I've seen quite a few, believe me. Also, before the final stretch of the game that'll have you descending into the enemy's demonic lair, just as you are about to get overrun by the baddies, the princess turns into a dragon and saves your ass, because why the hell not? While the structure of the story isn't all that terrible, and it could have been fixed with fewer plot-convenient happenings and a few more grown-up reasons behind every character's actions, there are just too many things in Solasta that seem to have been the product of, wouldn't it be cool? It's like the writers were making things up as they went along, justifying each decision with, wouldn't it be cool? Wouldn't it be cool to include a shady, retired, drunken adventurer who seems to know more than he's letting on? Wouldn't it be cool if a war broke out at some point? Wouldn't it be cool if you were betrayed at some point by one of these irrelevant peasants? Wouldn't it be cool if the princess turned into a dragon to save your butt? No, it would not be cool. Companions lore-wise, your little party of adventurers is the true MVP in Solasta. They are the linchpin that holds this mess of a story together. They were the one thing that kept me invested in what was going on, and the one thing that made me care about the state of the world and its tropey people. There's no comparing these guys and gals to your favorite top-tier scripted companions in other RPGs, but these guys and gals are 100% of your own making. You choose their backgrounds, their personalities, their races, hell, even their appearance. They start their adventure when they meet at the local tavern and start talking about how they got there and the obstacles that they had to sort out along the way. Those who are cynical tell their story with loads of sarcasm. Those who are lawful are all heroic and epic in their narration. Those who are impatient can't wait for MacGuffinus to show up. This initial moment, which is meant to be a tutorial for the game in which your companions meet at the tavern and tell their story before MacGuffinus shows up, is simply magical. It may not be the most sophisticated conversation, it may not be the most consistent in tone for a medieval fantasy story, but from the get-go, these people present themselves as individuals with their own personalities and goals. They form an unlikely yet surprisingly cohesive little family. They even show concern for each other when the shit hits the fan. And they are also the most democratic and collaborative band of adventurers you're ever going to meet, even if they make fun of each other from time to time. There are even surprisingly deep pearls of wisdom thrown around from time to time in addition to disagreement, suggestions, and words of care.
You look a little pale. Is something wrong?
I don't feel too good.
Shit, I knew that hunk of junk was cursed.
You don't know that.
They're not perfect, of course, and sometimes it seems like the game loses track of who's supposed to be what. There were times, for example, in which my greedy, cynical, chaotic halfling rogue came up with lawful good suggestions. But this is one of the best ideas I've seen implemented in a CRPG in ages, and I can only hope to see this in many games to come. Companions gameplay-wise, you don't really meet any companions, you create your entire party from the get-go as you do in Icewind Dale. Your party members are of course 100% to your liking, and they will bring to the party exactly what you expect from them. We already said everything there is to be said about them when we talked about character creation. Gameplay-wise, your party of adventurers is every bit as good as it could be, considering Solasta's limitation of its D&D partial license, secondary mechanics, and user experience. There's a bit of a learning curve to Solasta Crown of the Magister. Oddly enough, moving your characters around and moving the camera are the hardest things to learn and mechanize in this game, especially if you compare it to the combat, which is super intuitive. Solasta is very hand-holdy at first with all those pop-up tooltips, but you get less and less of those as you progress through the game, and it seems like at some point the game forgets that there are still a few mechanics for the player to learn even after a few hours. And some of those aren't too well explained. For example, it took me a while to figure out how to make your characters identify items, as it's not the same as in other D&D games. Also, your party doesn't have a shared stash in Solasta as it does in Pillars of Eternity or Pathfinder games. This means that you can't see everything everyone is carrying at all times while you're at your inventory interface. You have to click on each character to see what they have and drag and drop items to their portraits if you want to trade. And I'm too old for this pain in the ass. There's also crafting in Solasta, and it's both intuitive and useful. The secret is that you can make items that are actually better than most of the stuff you find in the game through combat or exploration. And of course, you find a decent amount of crafting materials and reagents, so if you remember to brew potions and craft arrows and bolts, you won't have too much of a problem with those. But crafting is done over time and not immediately, so you want to make the most out of the time you spend journeying from place to place. One good thing about crafting in Solasta that developers from other games could take a note or two about is that you can see the stats of the items you're about to craft on the upper right hand corner of the crafting interface if you hover over its description. Alas, you can't do this with items for which you don't have the required materials. Why not? Don't I already have the recipe for it? This information would have come in handy to decide whether to wait until I found the missing material or spend a few gold coins at a vendor to purchase a similar item. There is of course trading in Solasta, but again, you don't have a shared stash, and you can't switch companions in the middle of a transaction or compare the items that one character is selling to what some other character is wearing at the trading interface. Fuck you games that do this. All of you. In Pillars of Eternity 2, for example, you can always tell who has what and whether or not these items are better than what you're buying and selling. You can switch characters at any time, and that means that you can be absolutely sure that what you're selling is not better than the items any of your characters have currently equipped. It's also easier to tell whether or not you really need anything the vendor's selling. There are also a few things to spice up the Icewind Dale formula in Solasta. There is, for example, a little extra source of loot. There's some sort of scavenger mercenaries who serve the crown or whatnot, who clean up every location once you're done with all the killing and the MacGuffin hunting. So a few days after you clear a location, you'll get a shipment of goodies, and some of it is actually decent loot. There's also feuding factions whose favor you can earn by bringing some rare items to them. These factions have merchants who sell special unique items. Some of them specialize in potions and magic scrolls, and some sell armor and weapons. You might want to check out which factions sell the most interesting stuff for your party, and also double check which rare items are worth more to each faction. I found trading with these factions to be a nice little spin to the formula. So decent user experience for the game's main mechanics, half-assed inventory management and trading mechanics, nice little additional touches to the Icewind Dale formula. As a whole, I'd say secondary mechanics and user experience are decent. Sound effects and mix.
How tiresome.
Perfect!
Take that!
I'm in your debt, my friend.
Sound effects and mix for combat situations in Solasta Crown of the Magister is pretty darn good. Combat comes off as aggressive and intense, and that's because every spell and every hit packs all the oomph and power I expect from games of the genre. The rest of the Sonic landscape is a bit of a mixed bag. The worst thing about it is that cities like Caer Kiflin look and sound completely empty and not lived in. There are some areas like the tavern that are silent as a church, and that just shatters the immersion to pieces. Music. I like the music quite a bit in Solasta Crown of the Magister. Actually, I was impressed at times. You get all the orchestral firepower that you expect in a D&D epic adventure, and there are a few badass tracks here and there. But music is an extremely highly competitive league amongst these isometric CRPGs, and I am glad that's the case. But compared to other titles that have come out in recent years, and even some of our favorite timeless classics, the music in Solasta is not outstanding. Sometimes it's even completely absent. For example, there is no tavern music in Solasta.
What the fuck?
No tavern music?
0 out of 10.
One does not simply...
We have a musicless tavern in a medieval fantasy game. Overall, it's not bad, but it's also nothing I'll be writing about in my memoirs. Voice acting.
You called an emergency meeting of the council for a simple magical gem? Her Royal Highness has a busy schedule.
Please, Lord Denantar. In this chamber, I'm just a student of magic.
Here. Anyway, Captain, the council has a great deal of business.
They were Sorax, our attackers. Not scavengers, not bandits. Sorax.
Sorax?
Is this a joke?
The Sor-Akath are no laughing matter, Lord Fasek.
Oh, you know what I mean.
What do you mean, my lord?
How many times has the council heard tales of these so-called Sorax?
It's all over the damn place. Some of it is hilariously bad, some of it is decent, and some of it is surprisingly awesome. Once again, I have to say that I am very positively impressed with your party members. You have a couple or 3 different voices to choose from, and there's a ton of dialogue that I am sure is the product of the choices you made at the time you were creating your characters. And yet, almost every line is delivered with just the right intonation.
Which master?
How dare you?
Dare what? Come outside and look around.
There are some moments in which the actors seem to have lost the mark, but not too many. Your adventurers sound sarcastic when they are being sarcastic, preachy when they are being preachy, and doubtful when they are asking questions. And that is just mind-blowing to me. I don't know if it's a game of smoke and mirrors, but it totally worked on me. The rest of the voice acting goes from decent to terrible, and I think the high levels of cheese that ooze out of every pore of the story are partially to blame for it. Graphics. Let's start with the good. The user interface is lean and neat, even if it's not too medieval fantasy inspired as it is, for example, in Icewind Dale 2. Icons and text are exactly the size they should be, the interface design is impeccable, and most of the times it's even inviting. Dungeons are for the most part very interesting. Not only are they well designed as locations in which combat and exploration is meant to take place, but graphics are also for the most part convincing. But cities like Caer Kiflin, which is the location you'll keep coming back to and, well, spending most of your time at, looks bland, boring, not lived in, and overall generic. Look at the marketplace in Caer Kiflin. And compare it to this marketplace in Divinity Original Sin 2. Or Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous. Look at the taverns in Solasta. And compare them to these other taverns. Then there's character models.
Is it bad?
Dude, it's really bad.
No, it isn't. This game is going for $40 on Steam. And I don't know about you guys, but these are not character models I expect to get in a $40 game. They're amateurish. I can't put it any other way. They look like they were made by someone who had not yet completed the 3D Max Essential Training course. Look at the pose of these characters. Look at how spread their arms and legs are. Look at this guy's beard when he talks. A fake beard on a dwarf has to be the most offensive thing one can find in a fantasy world, especially one that's not even properly glued. And don't even get me started on the faces or haircuts that you can choose from when you're creating your characters. Compare this dwarf to this dwarf. What strikes me as odd is that some enemies are actually pretty well designed, and most animations are pretty decent. You even get little animated cutscenes during combat every once in a while, and there's even some decent facial animation here and there. I really don't know what happened here, but it wasn't good. Performance and stability. In my experience, it was near perfect. There were no crashes, there were no noticeable frame drops, and the only bug I noticed had to do with my characters sometimes acting wildly out of character, and the identity of my 2 dwarves getting mixed every once in a while. Overall, I'd say it's pretty good. Other considerations and final thoughts. Solasta was given the treatment of the ugly brother, the little boy that Santa Claus forgot. And while it might not stand next to Baldur's Gate 3 or Pathfinder Kingmaker when it comes to its production values, I think Tactical Adventures delivered a nice little solid and very fun D&D game. Combat is tight, and the concept of a party of adventurers who have unique personalities and who take decisions at every turn is simply amazing. It's not a holy shit game like some others we've reviewed in the past, but I can safely predict that it is going to provide solid entertainment for a week or two, if you don't mind the cheese.
And I have nothing more to say to you.
If you liked the video, give it a thumbs up. If you didn't, thank you for watching all the way up until now. If you like what you're seeing in this channel, please consider subscribing and clicking that notification bell to avoid the usual YouTube shenanigans. Share the video, but most importantly, never stop gaming, but don't let gaming get in the way of your hopes and dreams. Bye everyone.